Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is William Johnson. I am the program director for the PEN Across America initiative, and I work with our stakeholders across the country to advocate for free expression. PEN America is a membership organization, and the work we do is actually supported by our members. If you want to find out more about PEN America and how to become a member, you can visit us at pen.org/membership. Again, that's pen.org/membership. I'm also going to put that in the chat. Our members are made up of a nationwide community of novelists, nonfiction authors, journalists, editors, poets, screenwriters, essayists, translators, agents, and other literary professionals, and even a larger network of devoted readers and supporters who join with us to carry out our mission to advocate for free expression. As a PEN America member, you have a unique part to play in the defense of free expression, the celebration of literary excellence, and the amplification of marginalized voices. Working together, we can defend our precious freedoms, our freedom to speak, to learn, and to engage with one another. And with that, I am going to pass it on to our moderator this evening, Philip. Philip, I'm going to pass the baton over to you. Thank you all and enjoy this discussion.
Thank you, William, and welcome everybody again. My name is Philip Kneis. I teach political science at Oregon State University, and I will be the moderator tonight. As we all know, the decline of journalism is especially crucial at the state and local levels. As funding and access models for journalism have changed, smaller news operations have struggled. The collapse of print advertising in newspapers has seen newspaper budgets shrink, press rooms reduced, correspondent positions eliminated, content insourced, and papers bought up by larger corporations, which has made less prominent papers even less attractive to many readers. These developments have only hastened the cycle of the decline of local journalism. At the same time, digital subscriptions to large national or international papers have proliferated and oftentimes replaced local subscriptions. This may have a direct influence on the conduct of state and local politics. In tonight's virtual discussion with Oregon-based journalists and news stakeholders, we will discuss the future of journalism, the present challenges newsrooms are facing, and solutions that can boost local news ecosystems. And these are our panelists. Laura Gunderson was born and raised in Oregon in a family with a long tradition in journalism. She took a job in the Oregonian's sports department while attending the University of Portland, and went on to cover almost every beat at the paper, as well as writing a popular consumer justice column and heading up the Oregonian's editorial board. She now helps oversee the news department as Director of Public Interest and Accountability. Sam Meeser is a second-year student at Oregon State University, studying political science and minoring in Spanish. He is currently the chief city editor of the Daily Barometer, OSU's student newspaper, where he works alongside other editors to assign and edit stories and put together a monthly print newspaper. Stephen Schultz publishes the Corvallis Advocate, an independent, hyperlocal daily news source that also offers live town halls where area leaders and experts interact with the public in a moderated setting. And finally, Regina Lawrence is a professor and associate dean in the School of Journalism and Communication and research director of the Agora Journalism Center at the University of Oregon. She's also the editor of the journal Political Communication. Her research focuses on press-state relations, journalistic norms, routines, and innovations, and the role of the media, gender, and social identity in political communications. Thank you, panel, for the insights you are about to share with us tonight. And thank you to everyone who has made time to join us in our reflections on the future of local journalism as one of the pillars of our democracy. Now, let's get started with our questions. Just to open up, what interests all of you specifically in local journalism? What is your journalism origin story? Let's start with Laura.
Well, as I referenced in my profile, I'd say that my interest in local journalism it's in my blood. My great grandfather was a reporter and editor at the East Oregonian in Pendleton. Both my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, worked at the Oregonian. My grandfather was the managing editor 1,000 years ago. So it's I grew up in a newsroom and care deeply about it. I've been at the Oregonian since I was a junior in college, so I've seen a lot. I've seen this industry in its heyday when this newsroom had 400 people. And I've kind of worked through, I was in the sports department, I was a business columnist, investigative reporter, and now I head up our newsroom. And so I've had the joy really of all these years of seeing what local journalism does for this community that I care so deeply about. I've worked in the suburbs where we were delivering news about at a really granular level about people's schools and politics. We don't have bureaus anymore, but we still try to tell stories that matter to our readers. And I think to me that's the biggest challenge, and what interests me so much is how to figure out, now that we have to be much more strategic, how do we figure out those stories that we should be telling, and what do our readers need to know and want to know? And that I think there's much more communication today with readers to find out what that is.
Thank you, Laura. Sam, what do you want to share with us?
Yeah, so my father was actually a sports photographer when he was in college. He was he went to college in the Philippines, so a little bit different from Oregon, but what he learned was stuff that I guess was sort of handed down to me, because he was always still holding on to like a camera every time we went anywhere pretty much to take photos of the family. He's a very sentimental person, I guess, which is obviously a good thing always. But yeah, I decided to go into journalism specifically for the photography angle. And then I realized that I guess my writing skills were good enough to also cover articles as well. And it pairs nicely when you can do both photos and writing. And yeah, I think that it's just really important to cover local news, specifically because I think it's always more pertinent and important to the people that you are covering the local news for. And I think we tend to always put too much emphasis on, the national news, like who's going to be president or who won the Senate races. But I think it's more important, a good majority of the time, to be worrying about who's winning the local races, like who's going to be mayor, who's going to be like the county commissioner, that kind of thing, because those ones are making the choices that are more specifically going to affect you, and the ones that you have more sway over anyways. So I think local news definitely is important in that regard.
And given that you work at a student newspaper, do you see an effect on students? Can you get that message across? Do they see that?
I like to think so. I know that more so the staff members will be reading the newspaper, but I also know that the more politically inclined, I guess, or the ones that are just more interested in news in general, will be picking up the newspaper and actually paying attention to what we are writing. And I'm hoping that we can see an upward trend in the people reading the newspaper. It's not looking too great at present moment, obviously, but I think we can still turn it around, hopefully. Maybe a little optimistic, but I'm hoping.
Thank you, Sam. Stephen, you've been the stalwart for democracy and journalism in Corvallis for quite some time, but how did you get started? And do you still see this as something that has the impact you hope it should have?
Well, for me, it started, I'll just be honest, I'm an evil ex-Californian and I was a weird kid. And my folks would get the LA Times and Daily News every day. And around 10 or 11 years old, I thought I might want to be an architect because I love buildings, still do. Anyhow, not here nor there, they had this design section. It was awesome. I loved it every Sunday. And then I noticed the movie reviews. And then I noticed they wrote about something called a city council, and you kind of picked up as you read each day the way city government operates. And I noticed something over time that when the LA Times started to kind of cover something quite a bit, and it was perhaps not the case, that things were going as they should, pressure would develop to do something else. And to me, that is one of the just absolute loveliest parts of journalism. It is an opportunity to take something that's maybe not running well, shine light on that, and maybe have folks do something else, to have that sort of impact. And we have at the Advocate had that impact in the past. It's always amazed me, like, we did something, okay, one of my favorite examples, iPads in the classrooms, was years ago. There was a group of parents weren't hot about it. The district wanted to do it. It was a battle that went on the pages of a daily paper in town. Used to have daily news here, day after day, week after week for a couple of months. And we just bided our time, slowly interviewing each side of that question. And over time, what happened was, we published all of that along with our own viewpoint based on some research, what might be a good compromise. Both sides sent us thank you notes, feeling we had articulated better for them than anybody else. And we saw the school district basically took our compromise, and that's what they did. Later, I found out, yep, they read our story. So, you can influence what's going on around you just by doing really good work. We have something going on right now with a landfill that I'm hoping to get the funding to do a story.
Thank you, Stephen. Regina, you study journalism professionally, and you also are busy studying how the public interacts and how we have a forum for democracy. So how did you get started on this? Why does this matter to you?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me, because I'm the one person at the table here who doesn't actually, have a true journalistic background. So I come at all of this as a scholar. I'm trained as a political scientist, and my research for years really focused on national politics and media. So I was, fascinated with the way that journalists have the ability to frame issues for the public and kind of set the agenda for the public. And, their interactions with powerful politicians fascinated me, and the way they covered campaigns and elections. But then, so I never really truthfully was all that interested in studying local news. But then over the last few years, I started to notice the mounting research coming out of political science and communication and journalism studies that was all building this empirical case for the critical importance of local news for democracy. And I know that probably seems obvious, because journalists have believed and felt in their gut for years that journalism matters to democracy and to the quality of civic life. But the empirical evidence wasn't there yet, right? Because scholars weren't studying it as much. That's really changed. There's leading scholars now in these fields that are focusing on local news systems, which is just a new development. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we could talk about why that shift in research. But I really took that as a critical cue. And in my role as the research director at the Agora Journalism Center at U of O, we had really already made a decision a couple of years ago that we wanted to lean into local news systems, because for many reasons, but especially this moment of crisis, frankly, that our society and our democracy faces, it may be local news systems that are critical to sort of knitting us back together again as communities and as a democracy. So I became interested in that. So I'll just shamelessly plug for a quick second a report that we released last week, which is the first effort to our knowledge to map the local news and information ecosystem here in Oregon. And we wanted to do that just as a starting place, creating some kind of baseline for having these kinds of conversations like you're having tonight.
Thank you. And before we go over other pre-prepared questions, I'd like to invite our audience to also contribute their questions. So we'll spend a little bit of time with what we've come up, or maybe to prompt some discussion, but it's really also about you as the audience to tell us what you want our experts to talk about. So after everything that we've heard so far, what are the specific challenges that are facing you? And I'm not going to go necessarily by any order, but any of you, who wants to go first? What challenges do you see? What is it specifically that threatens local journalism? Or maybe Stephen, do you want to take this?
Sure. So, from my standpoint, I come at this also as a publisher, so I'm responsible for the business end. And I got to tell you, when I started The Advocate, it came down to there was 20, 30, 40 businesses that agreed with me that there needed to be something else in local news. And they tended to be small mom and pop retail and restaurant, because those are decision makers you can get to fairly quickly. The churn is high, the maintenance is high, but those people, man, I gotta tell you, they know the microcurrents of a community, so they're a good group to communicate with. You couldn't do that today. There's no way. If I saw a budget need come in, a month or two out, I knew I could spend a week or two doubling my efforts to go sell some advertising and meet that budget need. That is no longer on the table. I'm taking a look at the landfill piece I want to do. I want to do the same depth on that we've brought to homeless, that we've brought to hate groups, that we've brought to our readers know what we've done. The bottom line being, I don't know that we have the funding for it, or that I can find the funding for it. In fact, I'm pretty sure I can't. So we're stuck reporting on whatever the county commission has done and the committee that they've appointed. It's frustrating. So I don't know if it's a challenge as much as just certain things are just simply not possible anymore. And that's in a 10-year span that has changed significantly.
Yeah, I think I can kind of compliment that in terms of, I remember when we had this massive newsroom with different teams. We actually had a team once called Living in the 90s team, and it was more of a kind of looking at how people got by. Now I oversee a public safety team, a business team, an investigative team, and my kind of government politics education. But what I think that's really done in a good way is forced us to realize we can't do it all. We are very selective and strategic about where we decide to bore down into stories. And we realize that there's not a lot of good in necessarily always trying to reinvent the wheel. If somebody has done a good story, can we run that? So I'm much more often now reaching out to smaller newspapers saying, hey, that was a fabulous story you had on such and such. Can I run that and use the photo and obviously give you guys credit? And I think that's it's working smarter. And it's if we're working together to build a more collective strength, I think the pandemic really brought that into a more of a just regular practice. We had done it before for various projects, but we started doing it on a regular basis. We piloted AP's Story Share, where a bunch of different media outlets in Oregon put their stories together and we all have the ability to run them. We started a partnership with education reporters that one of our editors oversaw during the pandemic. So we were she was serving as the editor, and they were all getting together to talk as a group because there was so much happening in education during the pandemic and the lockdown. And we've also just partnered. So we actually run a lot of Underscore, which is a great media outlet in Oregon that covers indigenous issues, and we regularly run their stories on our Sunday online and in print. So I think for me that's been such a benefit of what can we do smarter, and what can we do together, and having those relationships across the state. I think get to what Regina was talking about in terms of making us all stronger.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Maybe I'll just add to that and say, based on conversations with a lot of journalists, editors, publishers, owners around the state of Oregon over this past year, maybe one thing I would add to this conversation is the degree to which journalists feel as though they're swimming against the tide of, sort of the, social media is everywhere, for example, in the sense that journalists don't know anymore exactly who is listening and paying attention to their work, and swimming against the tide of mis and disinformation came through really strongly as a concern that so many journalists have today. And that I think the sense of being kind of displaced or decentered in the public conversation has been pretty profoundly disruptive for journalists.
And I mean, this is somehow worrying, because we all worry wherever we stand on a political spectrum. We are all worried about maybe the president, Congress, the Supreme Court as the first three estates. But if we take seriously that media is the fourth estate, why aren't we worried that much about it? I hear all the time from students and other people that they get their news from Facebook, or maybe even from TikTok or whatever. I don't even know what that means, but it certainly means that people post something on there, which may come from news sources, which may come also from other governments. I mean, I grew up in East Germany. Our media wasn't free. Our media was centrally controlled. I'm a little bit aware of how propaganda is made, and specifically what comes out of Putin's Russia right now is very familiar to me. I see sometimes people uncritically picking these items of really controlled fake news up. But I also see that if we see media as being the organization that has to create a sense of accountability. If a journalist isn't sitting in a meeting, things can happen that otherwise won't happen. So whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, we should kind of know what's going on. So especially when it comes to misinformation, Regina, because you started that, and we hear terms like fake news all the time. We see that we need to make decisions, but we don't know how. And whatever we make our decisions on, especially with the upcoming elections, how do we decide? What do you see here that media can do, especially local media? How can you get the message out also to people who don't seem to care that much about local media? I mean, I mentioned President, Congress, and Supreme Court. People probably, if you're lucky, can name the governor. I don't know that anybody knows a state senator, and when it comes to organizations further down, probably no one knows. So what can we do? What is it that you think local journalism can do?
Well, I'll just get us started here. I wouldn't presume to speak, from the perspective of a newsroom, and there are plenty of challenges that local journalism is facing. But one part of the problem that you're talking about, I think, as we all know, is that there's been a growing distrust of media. And of course, people's understanding of what media is, what counts as news, what counts as journalism, that's all very much in flux. But there is a bit of a bright spot here, and that is that survey after survey suggests that people in general have more trust for their local media when you ask them to drill down in that way than they do for national media. So there is a reservoir of trust for your local newspaper, your local TV or radio station that there isn't necessarily for the national news. Now, the flip side of that is that unfortunately, the market for local news, as you said, is declining. And so what fills that gap when news organizations shrink, when audiences shrink for local news, what fills the gap is that national news. And we know that national news is more polarizing. It leaves people more angry, worked up, disaffected. But local news is still a place where people can connect and find some degree of common ground. So for me, in a way, that's the bright spot that I think if we can find ways to leverage that reservoir of trust and sort of reset the relationship between local news organizations, local journalists, and communities, that feels to me like a key.
And I think to some extent that takes us back to kind of our roots with good old-fashioned gumshoe reporting. You get out, and it's very hard, especially with hybrid newsrooms, which the Oregonian has right now. Our newsroom is open, but most folks are there a day or two. It's not always the same folks at the same time, and so really communicating that message of now is the time to be out in the community. I think we saw that we can do journalism in a lockdown on the phone like this, and that was heartening. It was a scary day when we shut down the newsroom. We all went to our little, I'm in my bedroom, and decided, how are we going to do this? Teams hadn't even actually been working for us that well ahead of that, but we managed to make it work. But now I think is a time that we're recommitting to getting back out into the communities. And we have throughout, but I mean with even an overabundance of thought to why we're out there. We're out there to find the stories, but also to put the face on what a lot of people I think want to say, the media. No, I live here. I care about this. I'm in your community. Here's what I'm writing about. Here's why. Here's my number. Call me if you don't feel like talking now. Let's talk later. I mean, it's establishing those trusting relationships with not only public officials and the people we cover, but also other sources and community members who might not ever show up on our pages. But I think that's where you kind of make strides, is showing that you're human and not a dinosaur and not extinct.
What's scary to me is back in April, the county conducted a survey about the largest spending project they've ever wanted to take on, which is a big old shiny justice center. And they found out that only 23% of Corvalisites knew the county was thinking about spending $167 million on this thing. This last round of polling they just completed last month, they did not ask that question. I will let you read into why on your own. Those of you that are journalists understand quite well. But the reality of it is that's pretty terrifying. We're talking the biggest spending project that they've taken on. Only 23% of folks know about it. And I think that one of the things we have to start doing as an industry is thinking about how are we useful in your daily life? And we need to be giving you information that helps you to personally navigate your community. Okay, like if you're a parent, you need cool information about what is a great resource for your kids. Like, where are the best free birthday meals? Where's a great resource for tutoring, like that. If you're a business owner, you need something else. If you are a retiree, where is the good advice, like that? So if we can be useful kind of really from elementary school on, and we're helping you navigate your community, and we're doing that in a way that is consistently trustworthy and authoritative. And we're also delivering you the news without a lot of the hyperbole that you might see elsewhere. We may be something that you check in with a little more frequently. And I think that would be helpful.
And are there maybe some ways you can find support from sources that maybe haven't been supportive before? So we have two audience questions. I'm going to combine them into one, because one question asks what you think about government intervention or legislative support for regional news. The other then continues that theme about how do you feel about non-profit regional news models that are popping up? So what alternatives are there to the current funding model? Now, maybe first the government and then the non-profit route.
I don't want to step on anybody else who wants to speak up here. It's such a fascinating question. So we do know that nonprofits are one sector of journalism that are growing, and there's some excellent research by, for example, the Institute for Nonprofit News that really delves into what's working in nonprofit newsrooms, what the challenges still are, and just a wealth of information that's emerging there about how nonprofit models can can work. In the United States, of course, it's more difficult to talk about government funding in the same sentence as media, because there's such a strong attachment in this country to this idea that, you know, the Congress shall make no law clause of the First Amendment ties the government's hands when it comes to the local news crisis. I think that many scholars who have studied this more closely would say, actually, there's nothing that prohibits government from treating local news as the public good that it truly is, and creating the context in which local news can thrive. So while we might be uncomfortable with just direct governmental handouts, for example, to certain media organizations, we might be more comfortable with indirect ways that government can help, not entirely prop up, but can help sustain local news, because now we know how important local news is to the quality of civic life.
I'm going to go ahead and rip a Band-Aid here. If you told me I was going to think this 5 years ago, I would have said you're out of your mind. I think we're going to wind up needing to voucherize subscriptions on some level. I really do believe that's where we're going to wind up. The economic model is not just in trouble, it's broken, and it's largely not coming back. I think there are ways to do that keep the government out of your newsroom. I think that we have to have good conversation as an industry about what that would look like, and with legislators. I know legislators I've talked to, and we're conducting debates this round. We asked them about the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, and we asked them about something on a state level for that. I know that there is some interest. So I think that we're going to need to look at that really quite seriously. And yes, that you have to have law set up in a way that allows for those subscriptions to be, one, voucherized, and two, to be voucherized in a way that does not allow the government to tell you what to do or not do. We do have some model for this with the post office in terms of postal rates and subscribership, that the post office gives you a break if you X number of your readership is paid subscribership, and it is agnostic as to what it is you are publishing.
Maybe we shouldn't ask the government, but the opposition to fund the journalists, and that might be more helpful. Sam, I hope the student newspaper at OSU is funded well, but you probably have some thoughts also how maybe some more support could be helpful for the work you're doing.
Yeah, so for the work that I'm doing, I think obviously with newspapers in general, we're kind of being propped up partially, or used to be more propped up by advertisements. And I know that with the issue with the government trying to, or with the government in this hypothetical situation, funding or helping to prop up newspapers, we kind of run into that similar issue that I see as being a possibility with advertisements, where you're kind of being limited in terms of your free speech to be saying only certain things that you should be talking about. Because I don't know, maybe you'll lose your funding if you're talking about certain things that the advertiser wouldn't want you to be talking about. And you could easily replace advertiser with government should this hypothetical situation unfold. So I think just in general, non-conditionality, just making sure that the government truly has no say on whether or not you can run certain stories or tell certain perspectives. I think that's always kind of just, it has to be a given in this situation, because if it's not written down, then I mean, I don't know. I feel like a lot of people lose their ability to trust the newspaper even more so, because of the fact that there's nothing specifically saying that the government more or less has some sway on what the newspaper is allowed to talk about.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of answer that real quickly. One, I think that even now we disclose pretty clearly who funds us, one, and then two, You know, the government, I think if we're going to be subsidized, we maybe should be required to be an X percentage of council meetings, county commission meetings, and school board meetings as a conditionality of being considered a local resource with ownership within some amount of miles of where you are. And I think at that point, the government shouldn't have any input after you've assessed that, yep, you're in 90% of city council meetings every year. The audit shows that, and yeah, we might not love your viewpoint, but you qualify. And I think we can identify that. I think if that law is well established and we disclose, that's how you deal with that.
I'll just quickly build on that and say, I think that there's there are additional models that are being floated and even implemented. And here I'm thinking of New Jersey. So a couple of years ago, New Jersey created a mechanism. Now they were in an unusual situation, so we can talk about that if you're interested, but there was government funding available, and they created a mechanism for, again, indirect government subsidization of local news in the public interest, in the interest of building up the robustness and the diversity of news around the state. So they created, among other things, a consortium that has a number of members that come from institutions of higher ed and the tech industry, and a couple are appointed by the legislature and by the governor, et cetera. So it's a pretty large and institutionally diverse group. And then they are the ones who become kind of the grant makers, so to speak. Now it's a new model, so we have to study it and watch it and see what happens. But that kind of thing to me is a promising thing to consider, because like you were saying, Stephen and Sam, like I don't think too many Americans are very interested in a model where government is like choosing a particular media outlet, right, to kind of be the recipient of government, funding and backing. But I do think more Americans can get their heads around the idea that, like you said, Stephen, like the post office that we all rely on, like who's going to fund the post office if not the government, or at least who has to sort of ensure that that civic infrastructure is healthy and can survive. And again, I would want to make really clear, I also don't think Americans would be very interested in a system in which it's all governmental funding. I think that government has a role to play potentially, but lots of other entities have an important role to play. One thing we're noticing is that funders and philanthropists are, I think, starting to get more interested in the idea, again, that local news is a public good. And for any of the other issues that they care about, they need to also care about local news, because how are people going to understand the issues that the funders and philanthropists care about? How are they going to be able to build public understanding, awareness, consensus if there's just a flailing or diminished local news system? So I do think, just wanted to point out, I think it's more than government for sure, it's other entities as well.
And I'm not sure, probably you guys have all heard of Report for America, but that's been one very helpful nonprofit partnership that we had recently. And they provide us, you apply, and there's newsrooms across the country, and there's many in Oregon, many in rural parts of Oregon, which is fabulous. But we ended up getting 2 reporters that we put on beats that we haven't had ever or in years. So we now have an early education reporter and we have a higher education reporter. And the Ground Truth Project is the parent organization for Report for America, and they pay half the salary for, and I think we have an option for 2 years, and it can be extended to 3. And that was a lifeline for us. I mean, it's very hard to build out a newsroom these days, and this is an option that, especially for newsrooms like ours that are trying to wade into the waters of applying for grants and appealing to foundations, it's hard, and you're trying to put out a daily newspaper and just apply for a grant on the side. It's very challenging. So this was a great entree for us, and I know a lot of small newspapers have found a lot of help in that way too.
I mean, one model we've seen is that local newspapers are bought up in a bunch by larger corporations who then still deliver local newspapers, but the content is maybe less local than we think, and whatever remains of local contacts may border on the banal sometimes. I'm not pointing at any newspaper in specific, but we've all seen this trend. I mean, this has all happened as a response to lack of funding, but it is my suspicion that there's much less of a buy-in to local communities, because at the same time you see, when this happens, newsrooms being cut, offices shut, and eventually newspapers disappear. Is there, I mean, all of you represent functioning newspapers that still have remained independent. Are there maybe other ways to combine forces without sacrificing integrity, without sacrificing the local connection? How can we maybe motivate citizen journalists to contribute in a substantial manner?
Well, one thing, and Laura mentioned this, so Laura, I'd love to have hear from you and Stephen and Sam more on this, but one pathway forward probably is more collaboration among newsrooms, like Laura was speaking about. And there have been some really interesting forays into collaborative journalism in Oregon in recent years. So in addition to what's already been mentioned, there was the it's a hard topic, but there was the Breaking the Silence, the suicide collaborative journalism project, trying to understand the problem of suicide in Oregon, death by suicide. And then this last spring, just as an example, Agora kind of helped head up a collaborative effort among several dozen newsrooms, because there were so many candidates running in our primaries this time, to sort of divvy up labor on covering all of these different candidates and getting sort of a consistent framework to be able to compare side by side their stances on the issues. And I want to say that type of collaborative effort is also really it stands a greater chance of success, I think, when it comes from listening to what the public says that it wants to learn more of. So that collaborative project actually came straight out of a series of listening sessions that we did in conjunction with several organizations around Oregon to ask people, what do you want to hear more of? What do you want to learn more about during this election? And one of the things that came through loud and clear is that people didn't like that feeling that the media were trying to make up their minds for them. And journalists know that that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to cover the issues as you see them and as the stories develop. But many people had this strong sense that the coverage already, for example, focused on whatever candidate is best funded or who's ahead in the polls right now. And so we need to focus more on them. So many people expressed resentment of that. They just wanted to see the candidates on a level playing field in terms of what do they stand for, what will they do. So the framework for that collaborative project grew out of those listening sessions. So in any case, collaboration is so important because that's a way to leverage the limited resources, unfortunately, increasingly limited resources of newsrooms, so that they can combine forces and create something that's, bigger than the sum of the parts. And I don't know, Laura, if you want to talk a little bit more about the project that you all did.
Sorry, I'm having mute issues. Do you mean the education project? Yeah, because we really had the two during COVID that I think, or were you talking about something else, Regina?
Well, I was talking about the AP,
I can't.
the stories project that you,
I can hear you now.
AP stories project that you mentioned earlier.
Oh, Story Share. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really helpful tool, and it has grown exponentially since when we first started. But basically, we would upload all of our COVID stories, and we'd reached out to several other smaller newspapers that started loading theirs up as well. And so it looked like a regular AP wire. You could go in, and we have often just called up a newsroom and asked if we could run a story and run a photo, and that's great. And we have relationships with all the newspapers across the state. But here it was already approved, all ready to go, and it's kind of like a bunch of journalists who are all running their own AP wire thanks to a machination set up by AP. And it's grown now and includes stories from across the US. I think there's an Indigenous channel, there is an education focused channel. And so it really does add to what we can offer our readers, and it really does help provide investigations that a smaller newspaper might not be able to do, or if we can't get out to somewhere on the the easternmost boundary of our state, I can look in there and see, is there somebody who's done that story, because I know our readers want to find out what's going on. So it's just a really smart way to make our resources stretch and to make it fast, because that is, that's what we're all working on, really tight deadlines and quick turnaround. So it's really helpful.
Thank you. And I think there are some hints maybe at possible solutions here, so that actually is uplifting. To a more depressing subject, we all know that threats to democracy aren't just because people say nasty things or people don't believe in institutions, but some of the threats are really manifest and sometimes physical. We know that in many democratic countries, both in the United States and in Europe, politicians are under threat, but journalists are under threat all over the world too. Have you faced any dangerous situations because of your reporting? Do you know of any cases where that has happened in Oregon? And this is an audience question again.
Well, when I go to my newsroom right now, sitting in the space where we always used to gather for our morning news meetings, are flak jackets and helmets and face masks that we felt were necessary for our reporters and photographers to wear when they were out in the field covering the protests in Portland for 150 nights in 2020. And we had folks who got hit by police officers. We got people who were reporters and photographers who were in the midst of the fray when people were hitting at each other. And then, as we reported and other outlets did as well, there was a shooting during that time between two different groups of dueling protesters. And we had people out on the street reporting and taking pictures that night. So it is something now that we constantly think about. We have security guards that sometimes go out with us so that they can be the eyes behind our folks, because it's really intense when you're trying to talk to somebody and hear what's going on and hear the side. I mean, I think in one of the questions we had talked about trying to actually report on the facts, seeing what's actually happening on the street, seeing what's being called a riot. Is it, our folks have to be out there. I think a lot of readers questioned, well, if it's so bad, then why are you out there? Why are you giving these protests, or what they had devolved in at one point, that kind of attention? It's because that is where we need to be to see what's actually happening. But it's increasingly dangerous, and I know that there are journalists around the world who face much scarier circumstances on a much more regular basis, but it was something that really came to a head for us in 2020, and we now have protocols around it, and we're very it's very typical, unfortunately, that we turn to that table and take the supplies we need.
Thank you. And we've already spoken a little bit about getting citizens involved, but nowadays citizens typically get involved through social media and through other means. Neil Postman some years ago wrote this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and he criticized how in an age of television, where everything we watch in the news is interrupted by ad breaks, we can't really take the news seriously if our attention is shattered. And that was in the age of television. Now we are living with an even more disruptive technology determining our lives. We all know that this has probably really changed journalism, sometimes for the worse. But how can we, maybe to move towards a more positive note, how can we imagine that this may be of help? I mean, if we see journalism as maybe one of the most visible manifestations of the public sphere, as the place where democracy should happen. I mean, we've all read readers' comments on newspaper websites, and some of them can make you depressed about humanity, but in most of them, though, we do feel, I guess, the need for people to make their voices heard, to really speak to things that matter to them, whether we agree with them or not. I mean, as an organization, PEN is dedicated to free speech and it's not a partisan issue. This is an issue that affects everybody. So if we try to find some kind of avenue for local journalism to thrive, how can we take readers with us? How can we take communities with us? Have you seen some models that can work? Have you seen how you could incorporate that into your own work?
I think there's a lot of interesting models emerging all over the country and indeed around many parts of the world. One that I'll just mention here quickly, it's such a neat model, comes out of an organization called City Bureau in Chicago. And they started a program called Documenters, and I'll post the link if people are interested. And what they do in a simple version is they train, as somebody mentioned earlier, citizen journalism, they train members of the community in sort of basic journalistic principles and practices. And then, those citizens become the eyes and ears at city council meetings, school board meetings, et cetera, planning board meetings, those beats that unfortunately have been cut at so many local news organizations. There's not paid journalists now covering them. It may not be a perfect solution. It has the advantage, you could argue, of bringing in a citizen's, community member's viewpoint to that work. I mean, true, these folks aren't sort of tried and true journalists, but at the same time, they're coming in with particular, rooted interests in their community. Like, are these people on city council, whatever, serving my community or not? So it's a pretty interesting model and, one potential way forward.
Maybe Sam, a question for you. Can you see something like that? Or is something like that happening already at the university level? Do you see students who are really interested in reporting or in being part of the community and shaping what's out there as a maybe basis for opinions and judgments?
I believe that most of the people that come to work at the newspaper are already people that are, just have vested interests in making sure that people on campus are well informed about what they should be informed about. I know that one of my coworkers, Finn, he is a forestry major, so pretty much any and every time anything happens in forestry related to the university, he always loves to bring it up, get it covered. So we get to see coverage of things that, certain people may not have been interested in learning about or covering, but because he was the person to be in charge of the situation in terms of covering it, he's able to, share some of that passion through the process, to make sure that other people can see why it is that he's passionate about it and why other people may want to be passionate about it. I know that one of the things that we covered recently was the trout population, which is somewhat interesting, I would say, because the forest fires in Oregon have been getting worse and worse by the year, it seems. Definitely, I'm sure that the statistics definitely reflect that as well. But for some reason, the trout population, despite living in lots of rivers that are normally heavily affected by the presence of forests, the trouts are the one thing that still remain somehow. So it's interesting to see that despite literally just raging fires, destroying much of the habitat around them, trouts are still just hanging out, just doing their thing. And that's the kind of stuff that you don't really learn about unless you have someone who has that specific niche interests that he can actually bring to the table, he or she or they can bring to the table and show it to the rest of the world, show it to the rest of the population. Just having a specific interest, having a specific vested interest is something that I think, especially at the student newspaper level, is definitely something that helps sell our newspaper, is those novel stories.
I can kind of expand on that for a minute because I come from alternative media. We've had people who have made it all the way to editor-in-chief that have no journalism background when they get here. You can teach them the journalism. They come from science or they come from the arts, and they come from an interesting space that brings a high level of integrity and a different view. Scientists, as it turns out, are very easy to train as journalists, and they ask questions that sometimes your typical journalist does not ask. And if you want a level of rigor on a long form research piece, you just can't beat somebody with some scientific training, even if it is a non-science topic. Like homelessness, they tend to be incredibly gifted in terms of getting to the bottom of something. Artists will look at the way something is typically covered and ask, well, why aren't we asking the people on the ground, right? So getting a variety of folks in a newsroom, really, really essential.
Thank you. And speaking about rigor, we all have to run up against time, and so we only have 2 minutes left. Maybe we end up with a notion about where do you see hope nowadays? It can be related to journalism in the future, but maybe in general too, because maybe the despair and the distrust we feel is because we are all stressed in various ways and we all need something to live for. Where do you see sources of hope nowadays? Maybe for everybody to have a closing statement. Laura.
Well, our news organization just published an historical piece looking back at our own history and its racist legacy. And that was something that it was a very difficult story, and it required a lot of reporting and a lot of difficult conversations. And I'm so proud of the work that our folks did on that and how it opens the door to more work on that area. So I feel like we are very good about still doing big, important pieces of journalism, but we're also out there every day talking to sources and telling editorial endorsements, all the things that I think people need to be armed today for this democracy. So that's my hope, and that's what gets me up every day.
Thank you. Sam.
As part of the newer generation, I would say that we are still very invested. We are very invested in making sure that news is told. And I think just because of seeing how national media specifically has been able to polarize, we hate that. We hate the polarization like that. So I think the newer generation is hopefully going to be pushing more towards that neutral, unbiased stance. So that way we can actually lean back towards just the facts and not the emotions that can kind of, just blurry the image.
Thank you. And I can echo that. Without talking to students, I think the situation for me would always be much less helpful. Stephen.
First, I want to say that I feel Sam's comment is hopeful, that unbiased, just the facts piece of it. I will say we do endorsements, but we try to do them in a way that even if you don't agree with us, you feel respected and informed, and we get feedback that people who don't agree with us feel respected and informed. There is a way to deliver any message in life that is helpful and can be accepted even if somebody doesn't necessarily agree with you. I know that it's going to sound counterintuitive, this sensibility about there being an aversion right now to news. News aversion is the term of art right now. That is a little bit hopeful. I think after a pandemic and Trump and everything else, people needed a freaking break for a minute, and I think that's healthy. And I think we can, as an industry, kind of look at that and go, hey, where do we want to fit into people's life? Do we really want them checking news alerts all day long? Really? Come on, spend 30 minutes with us a day and then get on with your life. Go hiking, go running, have a good time, lead your life, but be informed and consume actual real news. So I think we can re-examine where we want to fit and the way that we create factual completeness for you.
Thank you. And finally, Regina.
I know we're at time, so I guess I'd just echo the comments that Laura and Stephen just made, because they reflect what for me is the hopefulness, which is in so many corners of journalism, a real willingness to examine the role that media has played in the past in systems of injustice and oppression, but also being willing to rethink what it is that people want from news, how they want to encounter the news, what they need really from news. And to me, that's really the pathway forward, is listening and being in conversation with communities.
Thank you very much. This was very informative, very helpful, and very hopeful. And thank you also to Penn, to William, for hosting us here. You can continue following the journalists in this panel by reading their newspapers. Otherwise, thank you, everybody. Have a good night, and let's hope we can all find some hope. Bye-bye.